This is my 5,000 subscriber celebratory milestone Q&A video. I want to thank everybody that's tuned into my channel over the last year. Thanks so much for the support. It means a huge amount. And that's why in this session, I have given you guys the opportunity to ask as many questions as you can, and I'm going to do my very best to answer as many as possible. Like I said, I'm really thankful that you guys tune in. I'm so happy that you find my content worth watching, and I'm going to do my very best to keep up the standard and keep giving you content that you find worthy of your time. Now let's dive in. I've got my notes here on my phone. Here, these are where the questions are, so I'm going to take them one at a time and see how far we go. Now, what is a good collection? A good collection is anything you like. It's not more complicated than that. There's a lot of people that sort of have a feeling that there's a right collection in terms of watch collecting. And I think that happens with anything where people start to collect. People will have opinions, and you know, there's a right collection and a wrong collection. You'll have people saying, oh, look at this collection, it's just a person that has money and not taste, or whatever opinion there is, or it's, oh, it's just dive watches, or oh, it's just vintage, or whatever, or there's not enough vintage. There's always an opinion about what a good collection is. I think my key point is, whatever you enjoy collecting, collect it. You can do whatever you want as long as you enjoy your watches. Preferably, I hope that you're wearing your watches and don't have them in a safe. But apart from that, anything you like that goes into your collection is a perfect collection for you. And obviously, there's no such thing as a perfect collection, because you've probably, like everybody else, always want to get that one extra watch. But the reason is these are the watches you like. I only have one challenge to anybody in terms of your collection. And that is to challenge yourself. If you see yourself becoming too samey, leaning into the same thing, and again, if you are only into dive watches, then you're only into dive watches. But if you tend to just kind of do the same thing over and over again and not challenge your thoughts and your opinions in terms of what could be a good addition to your collection, definitely consider if you can just put something that changes your collection just a teeny tiny bit. I recently bought a Doxa 300T in bright orange, and that's actually quite a bit of a stretch for me, because when I look through my collection, I generally like more, you know, black dials, blue dials, very simple and easily stylable options, no matter whether it's a dive watch or a dress watch or whatever. I like watches that can work with everything. So I'd been looking at the Doxa 300T for a long time, but I just didn't like the orange because I thought it would be too stand out or too weird looking in my wardrobe. So I was considering the black option or the silver dialed option, because it would be more sort of restrained. And I just came to the conclusion that if I'm going to buy a Doxa, I should buy the one that's orange. And if I don't like the orange, then obviously I don't buy it. But for me, it was a way of saying, okay, this is where I have to challenge myself and not just go for another plain safe diver, but when it's specifically a Doxa, it needs to be in the orange color. So basically, buy whatever you like and wear whatever you like. But if you see yourself getting a little bit on the repetitive side, consider whether you can challenge yourself just a little bit. What is a good watch? I have to warn you guys, because I'm going to make a broad generalization that I do sometimes, but all watches are good watches. Am I saying that a Hamilton Khaki Expedition for $1,000 is as good as a Patek Philippe? Yes and no. Now, obviously, the Patek is going to be better finished. The materials are going to be better. Any hand finishing, if there is any at all in a Hamilton, is obviously going to be better in the Patek. But we are in 2023. Pretty much any watch from a reputable brand is going to be functionally good. Take the Hamilton Khaki Expedition that just was released and comes out at, I think, $1,000. This watch has a milled clasp. It has 80 hours of power reserve. It has 100 meters of water resistance. The tolerances are really excellent for a $1,000 watch. It's going to live up to the specs. It's going to be serviceable, and even for a $1,000 watch, this watch can potentially last you a lifetime. All of this is a consequence of modern production technologies, shared technologies, production techniques, but also standards for consumer protection. I saw this video on another channel where a guy was interviewing the CEO of Christopher Ward, and the guy basically said, the CEO said he was sourcing stuff for his watches from factories that were making components for brands that sold things at significantly higher prices. Now, obviously, he would say that because he's trying to communicate that Christopher Ward is a bargain and affordability, sort of real excellent price point watch, which it is. But I don't think he's pulling the wool over our eyes. I think generally the level of production quality that you have these days in pretty much every price range is pretty high quality. We all know the stories of, the flimsy 1980s, 1970s Rolex bracelets. Also Bakelite as a material for bezels. These were things that over time would be flimsy or break or degrade. A watch today, and let's just take a Rolex as an example, those watches are not going to be as flimsy in the bracelet in 20 years' time when they've been worn for 20 years. They are made much more solidly. Same with a ceramic bezel. Is that thing going to age and break and crack? No, not to any extent or to the same degree as a Bakelite. And all of that technology has slowly but surely filtered down and moved its way into lower and lower end brands, which means at the low end, pretty much everything you can buy is of a reasonably high quality. And you can even go so far as to say, okay, think about fakes, Rolex fakes, Patek Philippe fakes. Sometimes those fakes are ridiculously good and they can make them for pretty much no money. And they're not perfect and they definitely have their problems, typically with the movements. But at the end of the day, the base production techniques are so standardized and so broadly available that for, $200, $300, $400, you're getting a pretty damn good copy of a highly expensive watch. Yeah, they're going to be finishing details. Yes, they are. But basically, all watches are good these days in that context. Now, obviously, when you look at what's happening at the high end, they are using more cool materials and new materials, and they're finding new ways to innovate. But overall, movement technology, tolerances, materials are of such a high standard that, basically, any watch today is good. And you can even go into that when you're talking about movements. You can get a $1,000 watch today that gives you 80 hours of power reserve. In the old days, power reserve was something you got from the high end or mid to high end, and then you get sort of the cheaper short power reserve in the low ones. Now, $1,000, 80 hours. Then there's the other side of the coin, the aesthetics, the finishing. This is where reviewing watches is very different from reviewing something like technology, graphics cards. Think of a graphics card. When you buy a graphics card, you are looking for something that has the best specs for the price you're willing to pay. So how much resolution can it pump out and what is the frames per second? That's going to be important. And that is the key when you have to review these things. It's really down to those technical features being key to the user experience. You're not going to hear a lot of people saying, oh, well, I chose the Tissot PRX because it has 80 hours of power reserve. The choice was between a Patek Philippe 5811 and it had only 40 hours. And, I can't live with that, so I chose a PRX. That's not how watches work. Same if you're looking for a field watch. If you're looking for a field watch and you want a toolish aesthetic, you're not going to complain that it doesn't have Soratsu polishing, even though Soratsu polishing is technically very complicated and a very intricate technique. So despite a more expensive watch having more features, it doesn't make the watch better. Not in a subjective sense, at least, because at the end of the day, it's about what you like and what you put on your wrist. And yeah, of course, there are technical differences overall in when you go up in price range, but a lot of it is about the subjective experience. And if you like the watch, you like the watch. And I have watches that I think are, for me, better looking at $3,000 that are better looking than $30,000 watches. So rounding it all out, all watches are good from a base functionality, manufacturing quality and all that kind of stuff. Just make watches really good these days. And then there's the aesthetic piece that is, it's not linear, so it's like more expensive equals more better. It's always going to be a personal experience of what do I value and how do I like the look of it and what do I want to have on my wrist. And some people are going to look at a Royal Oak and say, I don't particularly like it. I would find that unusual. But having said that, that's their choice. And that's got nothing to do with which watch is the best or the worst or up or down. It's just the one you like more. Next question, how much is made in China? Is it even relevant anymore to ask that question? If you go back like 30 or 40 years, China was, like synonymous with made in China. These plasticky, crappy almost poisonous toys and materials that was just the cheap stuff that you saw in the bargain basement. Now, that's generally not the case anymore. China can be criticized for a whole lot of things, but in terms of manufacturing, if you find the right supplier in China, they're going to make some pretty good watches, or pretty good televisions, or pretty good iPhones. So to me, it's not an issue that something is produced in China. For me, this is back to the myth of the in-house or the Swiss-made watch. Swiss-made means 60% of the manufacturing happens in Switzerland. The R&D has to be done in Switzerland. The assembly and the casing has to be done in Switzerland, and there's probably a couple of other things. But honestly, there's a lot of latitude in 60%. I mean, 40% can be done somewhere else, and that's no questions asked. The additional 60%, how do you define manufactured? That's also a super flexible term. As far as I'm concerned, that comes more down to marketing and protectionism more than anything else. If Lange and Söhne moved from Glashutte all the way to China, moved their people, their processes and everything to China and just shipped them from there, I would be fine with it from a production perspective. The watch doesn't get worse if you just lifted them up and put them into China anymore. That's how good China by now is, or Malaysia or Thailand or wherever. Then there's the perspective of China and other countries and protectionism and consumer things, geopolitics and all that kind of stuff around job creation and protecting local markets. Well, that's a different consideration. It's fine if you say, I want things made in America or made in Switzerland because you want to support American workers or Swiss workers or whatever. That's totally cool. But from a pure quality perspective, it's neither here nor there. Taken in isolation, so ignoring geopolitics and wanting to support local workers, from a production perspective, I don't care whether Shinola is produced in Detroit, Shanghai, or Mexico City. There is, though, a completely different perspective that I think is interesting. Like I said, manufacturing has such high levels, especially in China and Malaysia and Asia, that you can produce a pretty good watch everywhere. But if you think about something like Silicon Valley is, and still today, the absolute mecca for the brightest minds within tech. Now it's changing. There are more places around the world where you're getting these tech centers, and you're also in the US, people moving to Arizona and to Texas and Colorado and whatever. But at the end of the day, the Bay Area is still this magnet for bright minds wanting to work with tech. Then there's New York, London, and Tokyo, which are financial meccas in the same way for talent. People go to these cities to work with other brightest minds within the world of corporate finance and banking. This is the case with watches as well. There are basically 3 places in the world where there is a super high concentration of talent: Switzerland, Glashutte, and I'd suppose Tokyo, or somewhere near Tokyo. It's not that there aren't watchmakers in the rest of the world that are great watchmakers in Austria or Denmark or England or whatever, but there's a huge concentration of talent in Switzerland in terms of watchmakers, watch designers, watch creatives. Christopher Ward is a British brand, but they have production facilities in Switzerland. That's not just so they can write Swiss made on the bottom of their dials or anything. This is a simple calculation of where is the talent, and can we get the talent to move to London? Or do we need to have a site in Switzerland so we can leverage the talent that's there? This is also the problem with Rolex in terms of their new factory. They can get their factory built fairly quickly, but the time it takes to train an additional number of workers to actually work in that factory takes a long time. But again, where do you do it? You do it in Switzerland for a whole lot of reasons, also protectionism. But that's where the talent is. That's where people get educated. That's where the jobs are. So that's where you're going to put your business if you want to be sure that you're not dependent on one watch designer who sits in his basement. This is where all the talent is, and moving them is expensive. So for the longest time, this is why these places have dominated, and that's also why it doesn't really change. You might get a talented person in Melbourne or Adelaide or Sydney or Auckland or whatever who's really, really good. But turning Sydney or Melbourne or Adelaide into a mecca for watchmaking talent is so hard when you've got this locus of gravity around Switzerland. So yeah, they build a couple of the components in China. Doesn't really matter to me from a production perspective. And at the end of the day, I don't think it's going to change a whole lot of things in terms of the primarily location of talent is going to be Switzerland, Glashutte, and Tokyo. Are we moving back to quartz? Where are new consumers going? Excellent question. I don't think quartz is making a comeback, but I do think a couple of interesting things are happening. Christopher Ward's a good example. I said in the answer about what's a good watch is that the bar for a technically sufficient watch is really, really low these days. I think I see a trend towards more affordable watches, more micro brands. Rolex and Patek are going to be fine, but I think because of the prices being what they are and availability likewise, I think a lot of people's eyes have been moved and reopened to more affordable offerings. Tudor is a pretty good example of this. You know, go back 10 years and everything was kind of about Rolex and Omega. These days we talk a lot more about Longines, Tudor, Hamilton, and Christopher Ward. These are, relatively speaking, low-cost, high-value offerings. Good watches at affordable prices are just really, really popular. Christopher Ward and others have gone from being these brands with these like semi-homage, online-only, direct-to-consumer brands to being brands that are actually being taken seriously on par with maybe not Tudor, but at least Seiko or Hamilton for sure. I think this is also a consequence of big brands getting a bit greedy in terms of pricing. They're setting themselves up for a potential fall, and I don't think they've realized it yet. I also think that innovation that's not related to movement technology and materials, but more towards design, is coming from these more mainstream brands and micro brands to a greater extent. I'd go so far as to say that brands like JLC, AP, Patek, even Rolex are a bit of a creative rut. They're established huge brands, so I don't expect them to be the biggest risk takers. You know, they are big, so business risk is not what they would do first. They've been used to so much popularity and hype that it's not just the prices that are their problem. I really do think that some of them have gotten a little bit lazy. I mean, who has really blown us away this year or last year in terms of cool watches? The RLX Titanium Yachtmaster is cool, but that's about it. The JLC Reverso Chrono, it's cool, but it's niche. Patek, well, they made the 6007G, which I think is cool with the carbon style strap, but it's not a smash hit. Well, what is a smash hit? It's the Christopher Ward 12, it's the Tissot PRX, it's the Pelagos FXT, it's the Tag Heuer Skipper, and it's the Moonswatch and the Blancpain Swatch. The big boys aren't going to die or something as dramatic as that, but I do think that the trends, the ideas, and the energy is coming more from micro brands, smaller players, or at least players in a cheaper segment. What is an acceptable markup on a watch? Oh, tough question. There are probably some economists in the comments that are a lot more into the elasticity of luxury goods and so on. But you know, when does a watch become too expensive? Well, it becomes too expensive when nobody wants to buy it, or when so few people want to buy it that the company can't turn a profit. JLC can price their watches however which way they want. We complain a lot about watch prices, and I do too. Having said that, I don't think there's anything indefensible about the price of a watch. I find it unacceptable that pharmaceutical businesses can gouge people for necessary life-saving medicine and hide and obfuscate the truth behind complicated insurance practices and the necessity of perpetual patents. That's a societal problem. An expensive watch is not a societal problem. Just let your money do the talking by staying in your pocket. Also, the world is so globalized that we have full transparency in terms of pricing. You can go online, check Tudor, and instantly check the price of their watches and compare it to Longines or Breitling or Hublot. We have all the information to make up our minds whether our perception of the value of a product is in line with what we say, let's say, is common or acceptable and what we think is fair to pay. That's why people melted down over JLC's price hikes, because we saw the increase, we saw it as the most aggressive increase of all increases, and it was, you know, we felt, a lot of us at least, felt it was out of step with the general perception of how much a JLC should cost. Some people didn't care. They felt the price was perfectly in line with where the perception of the brand should be. Cool. Me personally, it was a bit too steep, and you know, for now, JLC is a secondary watch market brand for me because that's where the pricing seems right. This whole pricing thing, though, does illustrate something else to me. The big brands have gotten greedy, and they've forgotten the past. If you go back, I think it's 6, 7, maybe 10 years, maybe a bit more, You couldn't walk into a store in Hong Kong without somebody throwing a Cartier watch at you. These things were practically handed out as gifts when you bought something else. Omega, Cartier, and tons of others had flooded the market with way too many watches because of basically bad supply chain management. And brands like Cartier had to buy back hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of their own watches to not tank the value of their brand. In the short term, brands learned their lesson from that. They tightened up supply chains, they stopped dumping excessive levels of stocks on ADs, and they got a better handle on which of their watches were actually popular. This worked. They started doing better, their margins stabilized, and then together with macroeconomic developments, prices on the secondary market went up and inventories on the primary market went down. But then what happens? The world goes absolutely bananas and everybody goes mental for a steel Submariner. Hype takes over and watchmakers, most of them at least, start making bank like there's no tomorrow. And this is where they make their mistake. They treat this hype scenario as a new permanent reality. It frustrates me so much because this happens in so many markets for so many businesses. Businesses see something happen and strategically assume that this is how things are going to be forever. So, we're super exclusive now and we're totally sold out of all of our watches. And in comes the strategy department and the McKinsey consultants, and they start upping their prices much more than the pure cost increases can justify. They also start looking entirely at the sales side. I think a lot of their costs are going up because they're not effectively controlling them. It's normal business behavior. If people are willing to pay literally anything for your watch, why care if the production costs go up by 10%, even though it could only go up by 5%? But they get greedy on the assumption that the hype will continue. But it never does. Never. Bubbles always burst. So just like they had the course correction 10 years back when they had to buy back all their watches, there's going to be a course correction eventually here as well. Some of the big boys are going to get potentially hit hard on the assumption that the hype state was the new normal. They will feel it eventually, and then they will have to adjust, and then in 6-7 years' time, they will make a new stupid mistake because they haven't learned the lesson and again assume that some sort of state of the market is the new normal. What are the 5 most important factors when buying a watch? I think I've said it quite a few times. Buy what you like, and most watches are pretty good these days. The baseline for good functionality is very high. Having said that, there are some features that I prefer to always be on a watch that I buy. Anything under 40 hours of power reserve is too low to me. The simplest grade of Solitas will give you that, and I think that's just a bare minimum. If it has a bracelet, I would prefer a milled clasp over a stamp. Not all stamped clasps are bad, but milled is just preferable. And now, even in something like the new Hamilton Khaki Expedition for $1,000, you get a milled clasp. Above $1,500, I want micro adjustment. It has to come as standard at that price range. It doesn't need to be totally on the fly, but being able to take that watch off and adjust it without a tool is a key criteria, unless the watch has a design where the aesthetic of the bracelet makes it impossible to do some sort of easy adjust. 30 to 100 meters of water resistance is fine. A dress watch with 30 is fine. It's more important though that the watch has some level of shock resistance technology. Chances are you're going to bang your watch much more than you are going to subject it to too much water. So that's just important. Anti-reflective coatings. Some level of coating is typically preferable. I've just realized over time that it can be really important in terms of legibility, and whether it's on both sides or one side is not that important as such, as long as the manufacturers have given some thought to legibility. COSC is not a deal breaker for me, but if I can get it, I do assign some value to it. Then there are the things that I don't care as much about. I don't care if it's grade 2 or grade 5 titanium. For my personal use case, it has no practical implications in general. I know that generally riles some people up in the comments, but grade 2 has never failed on me. Grade 5 is cool. Grade 5 has better specs, but it's not, well, it's like ceramic versus aluminium bezels. I like some Dove watches that have aluminium inserts because I think it looks better and it's more in keeping with the watch, even though ceramic is probably a better solution for long-term wear and tear and cracking and so on. So I'm not saying that there aren't technical benefits over ceramic over aluminium or technical benefits of grade 5 over grade 2, but there's much more of an aesthetic consideration to me, which means that it's not going to be, it has to be grade 5, and I will never take grade 2. It's up to the individual watch, what the pricing is, what look I'm going for, and then I'm going to make my choice. I also don't particularly care if a watch looks a little bit inspired from other watches. I'm not going to buy copies. I don't buy fakes, but watches are so similar these days, and there are so many things. As long as I can see a designer has put some thought into it, I don't mind that the Christopher Ward 12 looks like a Chapek. And yes, I know for the Christopher Ward 12 and the Chapek, one of the designers on both teams was the same guy, so that's probably why there are similarities. One thing I really don't care about is how popular a watch is. I generally avoid buying anything while it's hyped. I just say to myself, if I still have the itch when everybody else has lost interest, then I'll buy it. For me, it's like shopping for groceries when you're hungry. You always end up throwing all sorts of junk into the cart. What is the state of my collection? My collection isn't a secret, but I don't see myself doing a reveal of my collection anytime soon. If you've seen all of my videos, you'll know that I have at some point owned a Cartier Santos, a Seiko SPB 143, an SLA 065, a Doxa 300T, a Bulgari Octo Finissimo, a JLC Reverso Moonphase, a Tudor Black Bay GMT, and a Rolex Explorer 216570, and a whole bunch of Casios, and a Breitling. That's a lot of watches, but I consistently get impressed by other people who have so many more. I don't think it's a question of lot. I actually have to cut down on my collection size. Those are the ones that I have revealed. Now, why not show my collection? Well, because I don't really think it's interesting. Most of my watches have some sort of story to them. Some of those stories I've shared. Others I haven't, but for me, that's not what I want this channel to be about. Not my own watches. I want my channel to be about something different. Which brings me to what I try to bring to the table. I need to have my niche as well. Even if I had the connections that Adrian Barker has, I will never have as good B-roll as him. He's that good a photographer. Theo and Harris, I just don't have the on-screen charisma of those two gentlemen. And compared to Christian, I don't have that huge knowledge around watch history, which impresses me again and again and again. Now, ID guy, I don't have his sublime industrial engineering either that he has. I can tell whenever a watch isn't perfect, but he can also explain what specifically needs to be changed to get it fixed. I can't do that. What can I do? I try, whether I'm talking about a specific watch or a watch market topic or a trend or a manufacturer, to say something that adds something new to the conversation that hasn't already been said. I'll do a video if I see a different angle. I'll do a video if I feel everybody else is scratching the surface of a topic and I think I can deliver a meaningful and hopefully coherent deep dive. I do not profess to be right. In many situations, I am speculating as much as the next guy. But the process for me around making a video is about whether the watch or the topic gets me thinking, whether there's a connection or a fun angle or a perspective that I haven't heard of or hasn't been fleshed out. At least not in the way I think it could be. So when I did a video about the IWC Pilot Mark 20, my interest was around how you make a tool watch luxury without losing the tool watch vibe. Swatch by Blancpain, I was much more interested in whether or not Swatch could keep this up with other Swatch Group collabs, or whether the bench strength of the Swatch Group really wasn't that strong. I also spoke about Cartier being God tier, and I just thought it was a fun topic in talking about a brand that was popular despite being a fashion brand and a brand that uses quartz movements and still being respected by the watch community. The dissonance there was just fun to talk about, and I felt no one had taken that approach to the brand. I also really enjoy seeing what people bring to the table in the comments. Do they agree? Even more so, I enjoy when somebody disagrees and makes a strong argument for why. Taking the time in the comments to point out that my reasoning is flawed for X, Y, and Z reason is something I hugely appreciate. Because, and this is an example, when I did the Rolex versus Bucherer video, I had a lot of people in the comments saying this is the most coherent, the most amazing, and totally spot on, and I had totally gotten it where nobody else at all understood what the Rolex-Bucherer merger meant. That's, a great feeling, people telling me I'm right. But then I watched a video from another YouTuber, not going to say who, but that YouTuber had basically the complete opposite conclusion of what I said. I mean, one-to-one, they completely disagreed with me and had taken a completely different stance. But then I read their comments, and then you have people in their comments, in a larger channel than mine, and they're like, this is the most coherent, the best, and the brightest, and the absolute most correct analysis of the Rolex Bucherer thing. So there I was, my video, and my small but very loyal fans saying, you're totally spot on, Mike. And then there's this other YouTuber, respected YouTuber, saying the complete opposite, and all this person's fans are saying, you're totally right, this is the only correct answer and everybody else is wrong. That's fun to me. It shows that there's not necessarily an objective truth. The interesting thing is the conversation. And it's also, for me, it's also about developing my own interest and knowledge about watches. My channel is a learning experience, and all those things taken into account. Trying to say something that hasn't been said, taking a different angle, inviting conversation, well, that's what I have in my watch box just isn't that interesting to me to talk about. So that's why my collection doesn't take center stage. Which brings me to my watch reveal for this time. What am I wearing today? Speedmaster. I know, it's a little bit cliche, it's just a Speedmaster, but it's an amazing watch, and it's been finding a lot of wrist time. It's also been off for a service for the first time in 8 or 9 years. So it has a new Hesalite crystal on it. They did not polish the case, they did not polish the bracelet. I told them not to, so they've only fixed what was internally wrong with it, not a lot, pretty much 1 or 2 parts skipped or changed, and then the Hesalite. This is a strap monster, and this is the one that's finding a whole lot of time on my wrist at the moment. So that's my reveal for today. Question, and I have to read this one. Are we at the point where the tail is wagging the dog? In other words, are collectors still the tastemakers driving the watch industry trends, or are the influencers, celebrities drawing the design and preferences of the watchmakers? Why or why not? Ooh, that's a complicated question. I read an article in Fratello by Robert Jan Broer, or however you pronounce his name, who said, you know, we as a watch community expect too much from the manufacturers in terms of listening to the community. They have to produce, the manufacturers have to produce watches that people will actually buy, that the broad public will desire. And that was kind of his central point or thesis, that obviously we have an influence, but they, you know, manufacturers have to cater to the people that buy broadly, and not just, you know, this relatively speaking small community of people that care a lot, too much sometimes about watches. And that's I agree with him to some extent, but there's a special thing about that, and maybe it's not entirely answering the question that was asked, but yet I'm still going to answer it this way. The thing that happens when you listen to the mass market is generally manufacturers tend to converge on safe, boring designs. When everybody likes superhero movies, then suddenly everybody starts churning out superhero movies until everybody else gets tired of all the same superhero movies looking like every other superhero movie, and then people move on. And then the manufacturers or the movie makers are like, why don't you like our superhero movies anymore? Well, because you just keep churning out the same origin story over and over and over again. And this happens when you talk to the mass market as well in terms of watches. At some point, people are going to be like, oh God, not another integrated bracelet sports watch. If we're there yet, I'm not sure, but we're close. I also think the Skin Diver Black, you know, Black Bay 54 SJE 093 Glashutte CQ Blancpain bathyscaphe is totally, you know, really heavy at the moment. So everybody's just going mental for these watches. And you're just seeing this convergence into very samey, very similar, very just not particularly interesting watches. And the mass market will at some point just move on as they like, guys, come up with something special. And when the manufacturers listen too much to the mass market, you definitely get this convergence towards the safe space, which is really over time really boring watches. Then you've got the opposite end of the scale, which is the enthusiasts. We want, like, you know, re-editions of other things, which sometimes overlaps with the mass market. Or we want like really special things, or we want concepts. So for me, it's a balance between listening to both, because I do think listening to the market is important, broadly speaking. I think it's also important to listen to the watch enthusiast community, because I do think they also have an understanding of what could be interesting and what can be improved, and have a better insight than the mass market does. But then there's also a third thing. Manufacturers also need to think for themselves and come up with stuff and take risks. Companies that just do what other people ask them to do make mistakes. You need to sometimes say, we think this is a good idea, throw it out there. And I think the code 1159 is an excellent example of that. Now, not everybody likes the code 1159. The first iteration, I've done a video about it. The first iteration was not great. I think the new iteration is pretty cool. It's still not super loved, but you have to credit AP and say, okay, we're going to try. We're going to try and do something interesting and different and come up with something totally new and out of the box. And that's the kind of innovation you have to have, and that willingness to take risks, because otherwise you become stale and uninteresting as a manufacturer. Vertical integration and in-house movements are all the rage these days. With these steps, the internal cost for making a watch theoretically should have dropped. Prices have not followed. No, and that's back to the point that I made about pricing and these companies being totally greedy in terms of raising prices, because that's what they've been able to do. I think they've forgotten to some extent to control their costs, so their costs are actually growing even though they don't necessarily have to, simply because they're not focusing on it. And then the second piece, I think, is the costs are not dropping because they are just taking more margin. JLC and Omega, they're doing more and more online sales, direct to consumer via online. That's cheaper than having an AD network or a distribution network. Those savings are not going to be low. You're never going to see costs drop or sales drop. This is going to stay at a high price, and it's going to keep that way, and their margins are just going to increase. Then there's the follow-up component. In fact, in-house movements are touted as being more exclusive. Contrary to popular belief, should we be paying more for établisseurs or watch companies that use them, like Laurent Ferrier? Again, in theory, they're using movement specialists that have perfected their craft over time and are tried and true, hence the higher price. You pay what you're willing to pay. And definitely to the extent that companies are capable, not necessarily in-house, because I've had long conversations about whether or not in-house is relevant, but the true ability to design and spec and hand finish and so on, you know, very, very intricate movements, and completely build them from scratch, whether or not they're built in-house or they sourced components or whatever, but it's originally come up with. I think it has a value, and to the extent that they are good at it, you should totally pay a lot of money for it. How much? That depends on the individual watch manufacturer, the materials they use, the skill of the people they have, and the specific product in front of you. So how much should a Laurent Ferrier or a Vacheron cost, or a Lange & Söhne? Well, it should cost whatever people are willing to pay. I know that's kind of weird when I say that they're greedy. Well, if they get too greedy, then people are not willing to pay it. They're willing to pay, they're willing to pay. Quick question, Glashutte Original 70s versus a Vacheron Overseas Gen 2 or Zenith Big Pilot? Vacheron all the way. Great watches, all three of them. The 70s is not one I particularly like that much, but anything overseas I generally like a lot. What's the real value of the Rolex Oyster Perpetual, given that it has gold indices, but it retails for less than the Explorer and the Air King, which do not have any gold? I don't quite remember what the pricing is on the three, and I also can't remember how much there's gold and silver and all that stuff. But basically, they're all three steel watches, and they all have Oyster bracelet. I don't know if one of them has an easy adjust. It's not really important, because at the end of the day, the pricing has got nothing to do with the specs of those three watches. It has everything to do with how Rolex wants them positioned. The Rolex Oyster Perpetual is the watch they have defined as their ultimate entry watch, where the Explorer is and the Air King are not entry in the same way. They are just spec up, and that's why they cost a little bit more. Now, obviously, when you look at some Rolex models, you know, GMTs and the Daytonas, they have different movements in which add a level of cost. They also have polished centerlex, which make them look and feel more premium. But I think overall, if you just look at the steel models and ignore for a moment the precious metal models, the vast majority of them probably cost pretty much the same to make, give or take, if you exclude the movement. And the vast cost difference in them is down to how Rolex wants to position them, less so than the objective cost difference in producing them. At least that's what I think. That was all I had for this time. I hope you enjoyed the Q&A, and thanks so much to all of you that support my channel, and also to those new ones who have found my channel, and to all of those that submitted their questions. It's really appreciated. I hope you stay around for even more content, and let me know what you think in the comments. As always, like, subscribe. Cheers.